planet's on fire. It's a real code red. Got us by the balls, we're being slowly bled. All the swollen puppet head, the propagandize, big chocolate points, flat out lies. A house full of mirrors, it's a lousy reflection. Run hard left, it's a true direction. Democracy's in trouble, this news isn't fake. Everything we fought for is truly at stake. Border to border, coast to coast, it's time to view the talent and meet our host. It's a podcast by George. All right, folks, it's showtime.
Hello. Hi. How are you? Welcome on in to another podcast by George. Got another great one, folks. I got to tell you something. If I wasn't producing and hosting these shows, I'd be watching. I hope you saw the show yesterday with our friend Sergei Tagmaredno in Ukraine and Kiev in his apartment. I mean, those are just outstanding shows. We've had Sergei on twice. He says he'll come back on. And, I'm struck by the fact that he's so knowledgeable, first person, because those troops are advancing on his home, literally, there in Kiev. But also, he's very well informed, very articulate. He's a musician, but his wife works for one of the major television networks there. I mean, the media is all around us, and they're responsible for the way we think and perceive the world. I mean, we're going to talk about that today with our guest that knows all about it, and it is Ariana Pekary. She's coming on the podcast by George live line today. She's an award-winning journalist who formerly worked in public radio and cable news, where she became a key member of a primetime show hosted by Lawrence O'Donnell at MSNBC. You probably have checked out Lawrence before. Well, now she's working to rethink financial incentives in broadcast news through public awareness and advocacy. In September 2020, she joined Columbia Journalism Review as a public editor with a focus on CNN, but really on all media. And let's bring her in here and see if we can say good morning, get the technology to work. Hi, Ariana.
Good morning. Hello. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on in here, man. We got a ton of things to talk about because all of these things are interrelated. I all the time on podcasts by George, I talk about climate war in healthcare. That's the big three as far as I'm concerned. And when you talk about one, you got to talk about the other. And we're talking about the wars today in particular. And people hear your name, Ariana Pekary, and that probably rings a bell with a lot of people that follow the news closely, a lot of people that are fans of MSNBC. And I got to tell you, that's probably the majority of my audience. And it's because of a resignation, really. I want to bring this up on screen here and read through this very quickly. Now, you can jump in anytime you want to because it's your letter to the world, really. But you said July 24th. Was my last day at MSNBC back in 2020. He said, I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I simply couldn't stay there anymore. My colleagues are very smart people with good intentions. The problem is the job itself. It forces skilled journalists to make bad decisions on a daily basis. Okay, before I go any further, Ariana, now, I fancy myself a very small wordsmith. You're much more a wordsmith than I am. You're a real journalist in the real world, and every word means something. So I look at that and I think bad decisions on a daily basis. Holy cow. Now, what did you mean exactly by on a daily? We're not talking about once a month, once a year. We're talking daily.
Yeah. It took a while for me to understand. I was not, I didn't necessarily have high expectations going into cable news. I was hired to work on a specific show that wasn't really the normal format. Of course, that ended up getting canceled pretty quickly, and I just moved to New York. So I scrambled and ended up working on the show and tried to make it work. And part of me, the idealist in me, thought I could change cable news from the inside. And it was very confusing at first. I didn't really understand. There are lots of different biases, and that it certainly is a problem across the board. But it wasn't until I gained some level of seniority on the team and was in the real planning meetings with the executive producer, that I really came to understand exactly the extent that the ratings have on content. I mean, it's pretty much the first thing out of their mouth anytime you suggest an idea. It's either that, oh, that'll rate well, or no, that didn't rate well the last time it was on. So that's what I meant by that. And it really was a daily thing. And I wanted to substantiate that in my mind. So, I thought maybe I'm being hypersensitive because I came from a public radio background and we just didn't have discussions like that at all in our editorial meetings. It wasn't, we wanted to be relevant, and we wanted to have people paying attention to what we were doing, but that isn't what drove our editorial decisions. So I started documenting, and I was sending notes to myself and kept a journal, and every day with multiple times throughout the day, that is front of mind. So it really was on a daily basis. Some decisions are worse than others, but it was daily.
Yeah. Let me pick up this. Let me see if I can get it back in there now.
Sorry, I give long answers.
No, that's good. Well, that's what I want you to do. I mean, that's kind of the nature of the podcast. And I've got to say this too now. The cable news is extremely, the real engaged activist people seem to watch it. I don't watch it as much as I used to, the evening programs, that is. And you make a very clear distinction. I've seen in your writings and that type of thing that people need to understand that the evening performances, and I don't know, you might call them performances. They're much more opinion in the evening than they are in the daytime. And I'll tell you what, I'm not sure that I was even aware of that. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I guess to me it's somewhat obvious. And MSNBC went through a phase where there was quite a bit of opinion during the day. That Joy Reid had a show during the day for a while, and Alex Wagner, she kind of skirts that a little bit. And then a new boss came in, and he really wanted MSNBC to go more news on day side. And I think he brought in someone who had been at CNN formerly, and so they wanted it to be more repertorial. But the evening is where you're going to get the quote unquote analysis from, on MSNBC. That's Chris Hayes, now Joy Reid, Chris Hayes, Rachel Maddow, Lawrence O'Donnell,
and Rachel. Yeah.
And CNN through the Trump years morphed into the same type of beast. Dayside, you will see more, breaking news, straight news stories. And then once you get into the evening, Anderson Cooper, certainly Don Lemon, Chris Cuomo, they became very opinionated in the evenings. And you can hear it not only in the tone, but there was the topic selection. And one of the examples that I use for that is the climate report. I don't know if you want me to get into that now.
Yeah, well, I've got a slide coming up on that. And that's key because, as you say, it's the story selection. It's what's being chosen, but maybe more importantly, equally important anyway, is what's not being chosen, what's not being shown. But I wanted to see if there was anything else here. I'll read through this very quickly, particularly for the people that just get the audio portion of the podcast. It says, this is your resignation letter again. You may not watch MSNBC, but just know that this problem still affects you too. All the commercial networks function the same. And no doubt that content seeps into your social media feed one way or another. We are a cancer. Now, this is, I saw this move around right after your resignation letter. This was probably the paragraph or the couple of sentences that got the most coverage, Ariana. We are a cancer and there is no cure. A successful and insightful TV veteran said to me, but if you could find a cure, it would change the world. Well, I think that's still true. Do you?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And the reason, I had a conversation with this person who I really respect and admire. There's a reason why I wanted to have this conversation. My concern started a couple of years before I left MSNBC, and probably a year before I left, I asked to sit down to ask their opinion. Am I right about my assessment? And then what can we do about it? And this person said I was absolutely correct about my assessment. But then that's when he went on to say, we are a cancer, meaning there's nothing that we can do. Like, and if you're going to work on this, then you need to consult with cancer researchers to find out how to stay positive in this realm so you don't, don't give up. And that was the conversation that we had.
Well, maybe that's kind of what the cancer
Someone who-
researcher, yeah.
it comes from someone who I respect and admire. And it was validating to hear that, but certainly at the same time, very, very discouraging.
Let's see if we've got anything else here that we can take a spin through. Occasionally, the producers will choose to do a topic or story without regard for how they think it will rate. Again, wordsmithing here. Occasionally, the producers will choose to do a topic or story without any regard for how they think it will rate. But that is the exception, not the rule, due to the simple structure of the industry. Simple structure, folks. It's not complicated. A lot of this formula isn't. The desire to charge more money for commercials, as well as the ratings, bonuses the top tier decision makers earn, they always relapse into their old profitable programming habits. Okay, so this brings out the real cynic in me, Ariana. I mean, find out, follow the money. That's what they always say. And, on the left side of the spectrum, and that's where I reside. I mean, I'm left of the Democratic Party at this point. We oftentimes point to somebody way back in 2003, a gentleman that I know you're well acquainted with and his work at MSNBC. And it was Phil Donahue. For those people that don't remember, he was voicing opposition to the war, the Iraq War at that time, way back then. And he was summarily dismissed for that. Now, I want to play this clip. It's not very long, and have folks watch and listen to Phil explain to what happened there. And then think about what Ariana just said.
What happened to me, the biggest lesson, I think, is how corporate media shapes our opinions and our coverage. This was a decision, my decision, the decision to release me, came from far above. This was not an assistant program director who decided to separate me from MSNBC. They were terrified of the anti-war voice, and that is not an overstatement. Anti-war voices were not popular. And if you're General Electric, you certainly don't want an anti-war voice on a cable channel that you own. Donald Rumsfeld's your biggest customer. So, by the way, I had to have two conservatives on for every liberal. I could have Richard Pearl on alone, but I couldn't have Dennis Kucinich on alone. I was considered two liberals. It really is funny almost when you look back on how the management was just frozen by the anti-war voice. We were scolds. We weren't patriotic. American people disagreed with us, and we weren't good for business.
Okay, Ariana, that's one of the main reasons that I wanted to have you on the show today, because, we're on the brink of World War III. That's what everybody's telling us. And I'm following the news accounts in Ukraine. I'm looking all over the place. I'm seeing some censorship going on. I'm seeing anti-war left voices being closed down on, web platforms. But I'm looking at the major news, and just like Phil said, I'm not seeing many of these anti-war voices. And there's a voice to be heard right now, and that would be the push for a ceasefire, as an example, and a push for these politicians in the West and in the East to get off their asses, basically, and get together and talk this out at a negotiating table during a ceasefire. But instead, we hear about arms buildups and pleas for no-fly zones and escalation and that type of thing. Now, when Phil was talking about that back then, do you view that as hyperbole? Was he overstating the circumstance? And does that apply to today?
Well, I think his experience and my experience in some ways were different, because the end result is probably the same though. And there are probably two different levels here. So I think that there's probably on some level, there could be that corporate upper management push to focus on certain stories or not focus on certain stories, for whatever their reasons are. Whether it's, advertisers, the Boeings of the world who they don't want to upset or want to please. I didn't see that myself simply because that wasn't my job. I was a middle level producer and I wasn't in those executive meetings. My experience is a lot of it was self-imposed censorship, and I hate to use the word censorship, but that's kind of the result of it. And I think, I can't say that people at MSNBC or people who I worked with were pro-war by any stretch of the imagination. But there is something, I think, in our DNA almost. They would automatically go to certain voices. As soon as there's like whisper of a war of some sort, they get very excited and they're like, we have to get, military analysts. We need to get former members of the military or people who have studied the military. We need their perspective on this. And they don't think about going to the more diplomatic voices, as you said. And again, I don't know. It's a combination of they get excited about the visuals of a war, and they think that they're doing what they should be doing. But I will say my host, Lawrence O'Donnell, he was very cognizant of that. And he really insisted on getting, anti-war voices on whenever it came up through our time. I wasn't there. I haven't been there through the Ukraine coverage, but I can see he's avoiding those military analysts. And the format is, okay, and you'll see this a lot on CNN. And to a large degree, you'll see it on MSNBC. So they start off with a reporter round robin, that finding out what's going on the ground. And then the next person they go to is a military analyst to say, what do we do about this? And again, I think some of that is just like, that's just how they've always done this. And so that's what you're supposed to do. And they don't think about coming at it from some other perspective. And so that's, all of a sudden, once it's framed that way, that's where the conversation is going to go. And it's, what should we be doing? Of course, that's what we're going to discuss. What should we be doing militarily? And again, I don't feel like these people are pro-war, but that's how their brains are wired. And so that's why it comes out that way.
Well, these folks, they're military experts, as you mentioned. These are military operations. And when these news programs start and they're talking about the military perspective, I can see where some people would say give them a pass because they're military experts. They should be brought into this conversation, this type of conversation. But here's how I look at it. I'm out here on the left wing of things, and I'm looking at people. Now, these are the kind of folks that I follow. I follow Jimmy Dore, Lee Camp, Kyle Kalinske, Crystal Ball, that I'm sure that you're aware of, Eleanor Goldfield, the great Matthew Ho, Ron Placone, Aaron Mate, Matt Taibbi, and my list ends with Chris Hedges, the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. Those folks are not included. They're not on these programs. And like you said, well, they're not military experts. They're talking about military. My point, Ariana, is, but they were right about the other wars of our lifetime, basically. They were right about Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya. They were correct. So why not bring in these counter voices on the left at this point? Because as I tell people on my show all the time, I'm a once bitten, twice shy kind of a guy. If somebody is right, if they've been proven right, and the other folks have been proven wrong, I'm likely to at least bring in those correct voices. Now, another example of this is, George, you say, well, how can you say that they're wrong? Well, the Afghanistan papers in the Washington Post. My God, what a damning document that is. And it doesn't get the coverage that it should. It proves that these experts that are being brought onto these shows don't know what the hell they're doing. They didn't know what they were doing in Afghanistan for 20 years. And that's, to put it nicely, some people would look at it and say they were knowingly doing things that were harmful to us and the world. But at the very best, they're incompetent. What's your rejoinder to that?
I cannot disagree. And I will say, again, the way that they are programmed internally, again, I feel like it's almost in their DNA. If you suggest those types of people, they might consider it. But I think at the end of the day, it's kind of this group think effect. And in the EP meeting, where the executive producers get together to talk about what they're planning for the day. Um, if everyone else is going for a military voice, you don't want to be the one person who's saying, I want to lead with an anti-war voice, or someone who, has more diplomatic experience or has a different perspective. They're trying to please and they compare themselves to their colleagues, and I think that has a damaging effect. And it's this sense of fear that it won't be taken seriously. And I think that applies also to the audience. So the way that, our national politics is, we have a left and a right, but for the most part, the country is more center right than it is liberal compared to Europe, for example. I think that is also inherent in their decision making. They are afraid of seeming like this is a fringe idea. Just again, because we have thought about war coverage for so long being framed a certain way, and you go at it a certain way, and you format it a certain way. To do something else makes them very uncomfortable. And so, again, those voices, they might be considered, but they'll get, pushed to the back of the show maybe, and that they're the first ones to get bumped.
Yeah, if they get seen at all. And the great Matthew Ho can talk about the fact that he got bumped, and he's kind of permanently bumped out there almost. And good luck to him running out there for the U.S. Senate in North Carolina. Well, it is all about the voices. I got to tell you now, I want to ask you this, because these people were moving around, spooking around behind the curtain when you were involved on MSNBC and public radio and places like that. Well, I got to ask you, what in the hell are Jim Clapper and John Brennan still doing as experts on these shows? Because they've been proven, they've been found to have lied. That's the other part of it. I'm likely to err on the side of people that are correct when it comes to war. I'm likely to err on the side of people that are truthful, that have not been proven wrong. Those people have been proven to have been untruthful. I still walk by the cable news television shows in the evening. My wife watches them. I don't so much, because I just can't gag it. I can't stand it. And there those guys are. What in the hell are they still doing on cable news?
John Bolton. Andrea Mitchell had him on.
Yes.
They get very excited about people who have a military pedigree. And if they have stars next to their name, even more so. Mm-hmm. And they feel like that gives them a certain level of credibility, which it does. But that's just, they get very excited about that. And they are doing this against their own better journalistic instincts. I know that they aren't intentionally pushing us to war, but that is the end effect. And it's because, partially television is a visceral medium. You don't necessarily think critically about what you're getting the way you might if you see it in black and white on a page in front of you. You're kind of taking it in, and you're not looking at the transcript and you're thinking, oh, but up here they said this, and then down here they said that. And they play off of that emotion. And so if they bring in someone with a title, then it's like, oh, of course I'm going to listen to this person. Oh, of course I'm going to listen to John Bolton. If Andrea Mitchell thinks he's worth listening to, of course I'm going to listen to him. I mean, there are people who criticize those types of people, but by and large, the audience is a pretty passive participant here, and they play off of that. And so they're trying to appease whatever expectations the audience may have. And it doesn't have a good result. They aren't as responsible as they should be as journalists, and that means thinking about these things critically, what we should be doing. And obviously, this goes back to 2016 with the campaign with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump ran over that entire campaign, and I remember at the time thinking, "This is not good." I didn't see good things happening, and they were just going with what they like. We have to cover this, it's rating through the roof, and B, this is they chalked it up. This is an unprecedented type of campaign, and that is true. But you have to think about what is better for the audience. And they don't have, they will bring on these guests and have certain types of conversations, but they don't necessarily get into a lot of times the underlying policy that is actually really more important. And, if you're going to keep it on a surface level, what should we be doing militarily? Then, of course, you're going to have a military guest on. It takes a lot more to dig down deeper and think about what the context is here.
Yeah.
Currently with Ukraine, what was going on with Vladimir Putin, what is his relationship with NATO? I haven't seen, going back decades, I haven't really seen those conversations on cable news. You'll see them in other places, but that's an important discussion to have, just to help people understand what we're up against here. And the conclusion may be the same at the end of the day, but all that other context is really informative in terms of the level of intensity we're going to have as a country in terms of how we should react. And of course, if you see children dying and apartment buildings being bombed, you're going to have that visceral reaction. Oh my God, we have to go help. Well, let's think about this. There are lots of other conflicts around the world where terrible, terrible things are happening. Ethiopia, thousands of people have been killed. Millions have been displaced. Yemen is the same thing. I mean, I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know.
Well, a lot of people don't know about Yemen in particular. I mean, I do. You know the count in Yemen, the body? 350,000.
Yeah.
Men, women, and children, innocent civilians that are killed with our bombs, basically, in Yemen. And that is ongoing. And we've got a president, Biden, that's parsing words about defensive versus offensive weapons that we're still providing to Saudi Arabia to kill those people in Yemen. So, yeah, that backdrop or context is people need to pay more attention to these types of things. And like you said, the conflicts are worldwide. They're all over the place. I want to ask you about a couple of things here before we move off of it, because folks, we're talking to Ariana Pekary. Now, she's a veteran of these cable news wars. I don't get folks like this on the show very often. And I'm always curious as to what's going on behind the scene. And this particular question I've always wondered about, and you were there at the time in MSNBC. Now, Donald Trump wins in 2016. In the post-mortem, the analysis that they did afterwards, a lot of the pundits, real smarty pants people, sat there and said, well, he got anywhere from $2 to $5 billion in basically free advertising from these cable news networks, particularly, but even the major news networks. And that had a lot to do with him winning in 2016. I thought, okay, that's great. Well, I didn't know that. Well, they did the same thing all over again leading up to 2020. And he came closer to winning that than I think some people realize.
I know. No, I completely agree. I was like, Joe Biden very easily could have lost that election. And
Yes.
when you look at those swing states, the Rust Belt states, Wisconsin, I haven't looked at those numbers in a long time, but I just remember thinking there was if that third party candidate was not in that race, I think Joe Biden probably would have lost, because I think that made a difference in Georgia, Arizona, I think. Again, I haven't looked at those numbers in a while, but certainly. And I'm going to go back really quickly, but try to link this back up. The other thing about the Russia story is you've got Vladimir Putin as a character, and in Yemen and Ethiopia, some of these other conflicts, we don't know them as well. I mean, if we talked about them, we would certainly know them. So then, maybe it would resonate more with the people. But it's easy for them to talk about someone like Vladimir Putin, who is kind of a mean character in our national narrative. And so Donald Trump was kind of the same. And it was easy to vilify him, especially on MSNBC.
Yeah.
And to caricature. And I remember also thinking, he would make these statements throughout his campaign speeches, which we were carrying live in full without any real analysis or fact checking, thinking, why don't we take what he's saying and parse it out? And, not that you're giving him legitimacy, but to the layperson, you hear Donald Trump say something like that, and it could make sense. Some of his trade policies, maybe that does make sense. And they would not go there. Again, they're sticking with kind of they're getting the visceral reaction out of people. And they did the same thing in 2020. And the COVID segments, that's where it really ended up pushing me away. The COVID segments, the science segments were not rating very well. I mean, those are the important conversations to have, especially in May, June of 2020, when we were starting to learn a little bit more about how the virus works. But they were turning all of this, they realized that they weren't rating as well as they wanted them to. I mean, they were getting huge ratings anyway, but they weren't willing to sacrifice, a small percentage of the audience to actually give them information that they needed. They were trying to compete with the others. And so what was competing well was, the Donald Trump battles with the blue state governors, the mask wars, all of that was getting much more attention. And that, starting in 2016, we would, plan the rundown, and they would leave the A block, the lead segment, blank, saying, we don't know what this is going to be, but it's going to be about Donald Trump somehow. So by the time, our show starts at 10 o'clock tonight, he's probably going to do or say something. So that's what we're going to focus on. And it worked for them. I mean, that worked. But that continued, that mentality continued on through 2020, and it will happen again. I mean, in my mind, most of the time I turn on the TV anymore, before Ukraine, the focus was on Donald Trump one way or the other.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be in the form of January 6th or the investigation, into his finances. There was, an awful lot of focus on him. And again, it's because he is a character. I'm going to say caricature, but
both.
Right. And they think that is going to be easier for the audience to follow rather than something that is a bit more informative.
Well, the great fear with me, and it comes to the Republican Party, and Chris Hedges was one of the earliest people to point this out loud and strong, and that is if Trump doesn't make it to 2024, which he may not, within the Republican Party, they're not going to go the Republican Party for a more moderate person than Donald Trump, I don't think. If Trump doesn't make it through as the candidate for the Republican Party in 2024, you're going to see somebody out there that Donald Trump may pale in comparison to, but that's maybe for another show, Ariana. Now, I want to talk to you about Ukraine. Obviously, that's on the top of everybody's mind. It would have been nice if we'd had more coverage of the U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014. People would understand why Putin was so outraged and hated the advancement of NATO onto his borders there and was so fearful and all those types of things. And it would give him more of this context and background, which really isn't that complicated. I mean, it just wasn't reported at all. But when it comes to Ukraine right now, I just saw a startling statistic, and I don't know if it's accurate or not. I don't know how you would measure this, but they say that media coverage in the Ukraine is 400 times more than other violent conflicts in recent history. And those would be those places that you talked about earlier: Syria, Afghanistan, Libya before that, all of these violent conflicts the United States is involved in. Well, I guess the question for you is, based on your knowledge and experience, why?
Well, I have not been in those editorial meetings, but I saw it happen. Like I felt like I was still right there. But I knew what was happening. CNN, they've gone wall to wall with this coverage, and it's largely because CNN went there. And people have been giving CNN a lot of credit, saying, "Oh, look what they can do. They are actually a news organization." And I give those anchors and producers who are there in the field, they're putting their lives in danger, which we have seen. So I don't want to take away from that at all. But why is it different? There is a nuclear power at play here. So there is, legitimate reasons to be having this discussion about Ukraine. But you can't just disregard the fact that CNN has come out of a month or two of serious crises. Their ratings have been in the tank. Well, people have been saying their ratings are in the tank. They're still, doing somewhat. Of course, after last year, where CNN was number one, coming out of January 6th and all of the debacle with the election, their numbers were going to drop. That's my argument. They were concerned about their ratings. They had some of these PR problems. They had to, let Chris Cuomo go.
Yeah.
They ended up having, had to let Jeff Zucker, who was the CEO, go. And it was it felt like almost like a daily crisis for them. And this sending Anderson Cooper to Ukraine has changed that discussion entirely. So people aren't, focused on, what's wrong with CNN now, what a mess they are. They're starting to give them credit for their coverage. And when CNN went there, then all of a sudden you could see MSNBC had to react in kind. And so they both have gone wall to wall with Ukraine coverage. And that was, I highly doubt MSNBC would have gone wall to wall the way that they have if CNN had not led that way.
My next question, I just don't hear people talk about this very much. And I'm honest, I'm a big peacenik. I mean, don't get me wrong here. I'm hugely anti-war, so I have great empathy and recoil in horror at the images and the news coming out of Ukraine, folks. But do you think it's possible, just based on your knowledge of how these networks, cable news channels respond to ratings and that type of thing, that by caring as much as we do about the Ukrainian people, we could actually be prolonging or extending this war? I mean, that's kind of a crazy question, but the coverage anyway, like you said, it's hugely disproportionate to the other conflicts around the world. Well, if we care, if we watch, if we're concerned, I don't know how you can build on 400 times more, but we're going to get plenty of this type of coverage.
Didn't Vladimir Putin invade Crimea?
Yeah. What was that? Or how much coverage did they?
Wall with that. And so, again, what happens now is, by going wall to wall with this coverage and showing, these horrible personal stories, which they are, but so are the women being raped in Ethiopia. Those are horrible stories as well that we aren't seeing. And but as soon as you show those images and tell those stories to the American people, that puts pressure on our leadership to do something. And Vladimir Putin knows that. And so will this prolong the problem? I feel like, if it's the United States, which if we enact a no-fly zone, I mean, I'm not a military expert, but it will be predominantly American weaponry and resources at stake there. And so that does turn into, something else. And I can't predict what is going to happen. I can't predict Vladimir Putin's, what he's going to do next. But I can tell you that this certainly has put a lot of pressure on American leadership to react, and that's probably going to be reacting militarily,
Well,
and
the best part, yeah,
that gives Putin fuel. So where does
yeah,
that end?
that's exactly right. I was going to tell folks one of the best parts of the show is getting to talk to folks like Ariana that we don't usually have access to. With her knowledge base and experience, and with the Columbia Journalism Review. Now, what she's doing, focusing a lot on, is CNN, and we've talked about that before. Now, with me, and I mentioned the big three, and let's bring this up again. There, let's see if we can bring. Yeah, I mean, it's the climate, war, and healthcare. And I tell people that I list climate number one because, to me, it's the overarching issue of our day. There are this IPCC report that just came out from the UN that's wrapping up. It's basically telling us that if we don't do anything, we've got 2 generations basically of survival for humankind on the planet. And we live in a 2020 world. It's what I used to say a lot in 2020. Well, 20 minutes if it's a nuclear strike of some type, 20 years if it's because of climate. So I talk about climate all the time, and it's not getting coverage at all, and really never has very much. And this goes to a piece that you authored on climate coverage. It's day and night. And this goes back to last summer. But again, you're talking also about this UN report. Last Monday, the United Nations releasing an alarming report on climate change, warning the problem is widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and code red for humanity. People that hear my little theme song at the beginning talks about a code red. That's why that's in there. CNN covered the story in 11 reports spanning 33 minutes. But it all occurred outside of prime time hours when most viewers are tuned in. And we talked about that earlier as to when people are watching these shows. When the report was released at 4 a.m. on the East Coast, CNN's chief climate correspondent, Bob Weir, was on standby to summarize the findings. Each show between 4 a.m. and 11 a.m. did a segment on the UN report. The last full segment on the subject aired during the 1 p.m. hour through the 3 p.m. hour host, Victor Blackwell, discussing the report during one of his interviews. Then the coverage dropped off. From 3:30 up until almost midnight, no host focused on the report. Not Aaron Burnett, not Anderson Cooper, nor 2 hours of Wilf Blitzer. At 9 p.m., with Chris Cuomo on vacation, CNN aired an interview with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, folks. It was most likely pre-taped. So they didn't discuss the UN report, probably wasn't out then, nor did they discuss the Green New Deal, the Congresswoman's signature bill. At 10 p.m., Don Lemon tucked a segment on the report at the end of his second hour, starting at about 11:45 p.m. A stark divide between day and evening across the cable news sphere. Prime time morphs into opinion and polarizing narratives. We talked about that earlier, while Dayside presents more news and facts. On Monday, if you were able to watch CNN during the day, not a luxury open to many, then you would have learned about the climate report, COVID hotbeds throughout the country, Taliban gains in Afghanistan, and the Dixie Fire in California. Conversely, during prime time now, nearly every show led with the same topic. CNN's foil du jour, Ron DeSantis. Yeah. Primetime resorts to opinion at night because it's the most competitive time of day when they can charge the most for advertisements. My God, really? Yeah. They're scraping for eyeballs. And since television is a visceral medium, TV audience aren't necessarily logical. It's easier to keep them watching with material that makes them angry, politics, rather than depressed. Think melting ice caps. Now, this is interesting, and you see that on screen. Just talk about this, Ariana. A lot of people don't understand, to some people, MSNBC and Fox, for instance, are their whole world. I mean, it's how they see and hear and think about everything. But for the rest of the world, not so much.
Yeah, so I don't know exactly what the question there is. Is that the difference between Dayside and
Well, the difference between the cable news programs, which in the evening we think, is everything, but people are still getting the majority of their news from the broadcast television news segments. The evening news is an example.
that is true. Those numbers are anywhere, I'd say 6-7 million for those evening network news shows. In cable, I think total viewers, Fox News tops out around 3 million for a total hour during
Mhm.
prime time. And CNN, MSNBC, kind of somewhere between 1 and 2 million, depending on what's happened, total audience. So yeah, when you look at the numbers that way, you say, of course, the networks have more influence. But I like to break this down a little bit further because those shows are only 30 minutes. Cable news is on 24 hours a day. Likewise, those network news programs, they may start with news of the day. It may be, there may be some politics at the top of those shows, but then they usually move on and do other lifestyle type stories, some news that might not be hard news necessarily. They aren't on politics the whole time the way that it is on cable. And so certainly the number, it's hard to compare. They're different beasts from what, every person I've spoken to behind closed doors who's worked in network news will say, yeah, we're just as that's our main driver. So again, network news is going to be feeding the audiences what they think they want. And as soon as you can move off of politics, you're probably going to keep more people that way. Again, that's their motivation, is they're competing for eyeballs.
No, that's good. And it's all about the mighty buck, which surprises me when it comes to supposedly hard news like this. But I guess who's naive, Kay? I shouldn't be thinking like that. I've got to ask you now. We're running out of time, and I knew this would happen. We could do half a dozen shows like this probably, but we talked about these sources, and to me, they're all important. And I talked about the Jim Clapper and the John Brennan type people on the intel side. But how responsible are they for really, to me, curating the news and our perspectives? Am I putting too much focus and emphasis on those folks? Because we hear all of these unnamed sources and people that aren't on the record, and they're on background, and the news agencies are fighting for the lead, and they want to be first with these stories. So they're running out there with things that are sometimes, patently ridiculous, like the Afghans being offered bounties for U.S. soldiers. I mean, it's just begs credulity. But are those intel sources responsible for? And I'm going to, okay, so here's where I'm getting up to. I'm going to put this up on screen. I've played this a couple of times recently for my viewers. But this is a guy that was the head intel guy. This is Pompeo, the former CIA director. Watch this.
When I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
So I keep going back to this, Ariana. We talked about those military experts that have been proven wrong copacetically about these wars of our time. The WAPO reporting, the Afghanistan papers had proven that. You've got people like Pompeo openly admitting that that's really what the CIA does. I mean, maybe their primary, even overt operation is to lie, to propagandize, to deceive. Why are these news agencies relying on those people? My God, to me, that's just shocking. I wouldn't believe anything that man or any of his cohorts said, and I certainly wouldn't base a report on it. I certainly wouldn't put them on the set, and yet that's what's happening every night on the cable news shows.
Well, he said it. It's the glory of the American experiment.
Mm.
And I again, it goes back. I feel like it's in our DNA, and so journalists are also citizens, and this country was built, came out of a war, Revolutionary War. Before that, there were the attacks on Native Americans, genocide, and of course the Civil War. And that is our national narrative. And we are largely proud of our ability to conquer that way. And so I feel like that is a huge mental block for people in journalism to get past. And that they know that is what the American people, that's how everybody is programmed. And so the idea that we're not going to have these discussions with people who did well in the military, who were rewarded for following the chain of command in the military. I think that they think that's a very foreign idea. I wish that they would think more critically about that. And again, I don't feel like these people are, want to promote war. They don't want to help lead us to war, but that is the end effect of the programming that they do. I had a thought, but I lost it. Sorry.
That's happens to me all the time. Don't feel
it will come
bad.
back to me, but
That's all right. And actually, we're coming up here to the close of our hour. I like to hold these live lines to about an hour or so. We'll get her back, folks. Ariana Pekary, the award-winning journalist. She's now working with the Columbia Journalism Review, critiquing and analyzing the media of our day. And my God, we're sitting on the precipice of a world war, some folks say, and the nuclear weapons saber is being rattled out there. And Ariana mentioned that earlier. I mean, these are two nuclear powers now that are staring one another down. A lot of people will say NATO and Russia, but really it's the United States and Russia. As we wrap up, as we close this particular live line, Ariana, anything you want to say to kind of maybe caution people about what they're seeing and hearing, or kind of give people some tips or hints as to what to look for or what to listen for in their coverage of the war in Ukraine, or really any of the conflicts around the world, or the climate, or any of the important news of the day?
I mean, if they're watching your show or listening to the podcast, that's a start. I would say look for other sources. I would, if you're watching cable news, I would take that information with a bit of a grain of salt. I mean, it's not necessarily bad information. There's a lot that I like about, say, Rachel Maddow or Chris Hayes. I think that they're, very smart in many ways. But I also know that they are overplaying their hand, as far as I'm concerned, in some ways. And they just, so much of this content is focused on what is gonna make you angry. And not long ago, I watched Rachel Maddow when she was still on air. By the end of her A block, I was raging. I was really angry, but it wasn't productive anger. It was something that was just anger for the sake of being anger. And I don't think that is helping any of us. And I can, when I started at MSNBC, I felt like there was some value in being the antidote to conservative media like Fox News or Rush Limbaugh. But I just feel like it is taking us down a downward spiral as each of them kind of, caricatures the other. Chris Hayes, he led his segment, a couple of nights ago with Tucker Carlson, which, I understand that story. There was a memo from the Russian government that said, play Tucker Carlson as much as possible to Russian TV outlets. So he's being used for propaganda. That is something that's worth noting. But to lead with it in the middle of a war and everything else that's going on, I would not have made that decision, but I know why he did. It's, he's amping up, that anger towards the other. And I just, I wish there were, a way to, for us to have better conversations together with people who are the other. and cable news is just making that worse. And so I would look for other sources. And I come from a public radio background, and I just always, whenever I listen to public radio, I will say I learned something and I'm not angry. So I would use those sources. Read is a good way to get good information. And personally, I tend to triangulate. I don't rely on any one source for a variety of reasons, but it takes a lot of work. And I hope at some point to be able to create a better environment for TV or screen people who want to watch news, that environment.
I like that description, triangulate. I mean, you got the left, you got the center, you got the right. That's the triangle that Ariana is talking about, folks.
It's not even just political. It could be it could be, scientific information that you're trying, like, okay, so this science report says this, and what about, is there something else going on here? Yeah.
Right. And to be able to do that, you have to have access to the sources. You can't have censorship. You can't have Phil Donahue, as we showed the great Phil Donahue on the show earlier, fired. Ed Schultz was fired from MSNBC because he was a Bernie supporter and he was calling out the Clintons on air as an example. Those are the two most prominent examples from the past. But now we've got my left wing friends being censored on social media all over the place. Lee Camp, probably the most notable example of that. And as I tell people, RT America's been taken off the air. Hell, I used to go there just to see what those folks were saying. That's where Chris Hedges was, for God's sake. He's a former New York Times, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. Lee Camp had a show on there. Eddie Ventura had a show on there. Abby Martin was on there at one time. I mean, my God, those are just great thinkers and journalists of our time. We can't be censoring and shutting down these alternative news sources, or as Ariana says, you won't be able to do the triangulation. You won't be able to put together the whole picture, particularly if you're just relying on your favorite TV cable evening news host. Ariana, this has been great. I mean, I've really enjoyed this. Thanks for coming on a podcast by George Live Line.
Thank you for having me and taking up this very important topic.
That's great, folks. Our guest today has been Ariana Pekary. She's an award-winning journalist. She's she started out in public radio and then was on cable news. She became a big part of the primetime show with Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC and resigned in protest in 2020 of what she was seeing, not just with that show, but really across all of the television networks. And she's working to rethink this financial incentive that we were talking about in broadcast news through public awareness and advocacy in a role with the Columbia Journalism Review. And folks, if you like podcasts by George, if you like access to people like Ariana Pekary, now, because it's not about me at all, really. I'm not the expert. I'm not the insider. I'm not the person that's been fighting these wars like Ariana has been. If you like getting her perspective via my show, just go to podcastbygeorge.com. Pick the platform. I mean, it could be iTunes, it could be Spotify, or the iHeartRadio app, YouTube, of course, and Facebook, and you'll be able to get each and every show in video or audio if that's what you prefer. But that's going to do it. That's going to wrap it up. That's all there is, and there ain't no more. That's another podcast by George.